Today, Bernadette Smith, founder of Equality Institute, she joins us on The Communicative Leader. She shares her experience as a leader in the DEI space and discusses the importance of bringing everyone into the conversation. She also highlights the role of humility in leadership and the power of storytelling. Hello, and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. Well, Bernadette, thank you so much for joining us on The Communicative Leader. I'm really excited to learn from you today. And before we dive in and have this really important conversation, can you give us a little bit of a background in your experience within leadership arena or DEI?
Yeah, so I have my own business called Equality Institute, and I've been a business owner for about 20 years or so now. And so, that has made me a leader. And so, with people on my team, external vendors and suppliers, leading my clients. And so there've just been, I've worn a lot of leadership hats, also in some volunteer capacities as well. And so, to me, it's just sort of who I am. And I really love what I get to do. And I'm right now, I'm a thought leader. I write and I speak, and my focus is about really bringing everyone into the DEI conversation and helping folks realize that DEI means everyone, right? And that we really need to think about DEI holistically across all functions of an organization. So I have a lot of passion around these topics.
And that is essential, right? More now than ever. And that leads us to this next question. So I'm wondering, if you can talk to us about how you identify with or engage with influencers and change makers. I mean, certainly you are one, but in this DEI space to help to drive that positive change.
Well, one thing that, positive change is my brand. That is absolutely what I'm completely passionate about. And so I write a newsletter called 5 Things, bringing good vibes to DEI. And every week I search for stories of what's going right in the world, stories that we can be inspired by and learn from, because there is so much negative data out there. And yes, it's important to acknowledge the oppression and the work that's yet to be done. But also, we got to celebrate what's going right. And so the positive change. So I write this newsletter, and then I have my own podcast on Monday in which I talk with someone else about those 5 stories. And those are other change makers, right? I invite other change makers, other influencers on my show. And, it's a great way to celebrate what's going right in the world and how we can do more of this positive change.
Exactly. And with the work that you're doing, I imagine all of that positive is the fuel you need when you're seeing continued oppression and inequalities. It's recognizing, okay, we still have a ways to go. And we probably always will, honestly, be working on these things, but recognizing that good is what helps you to keep going.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that it's important to recognize the good, but also I'm really try to stay mindful of my privilege at all times, because I have a lot of it. And so I don't experience some of the oppression that these positive changes directly impact. They don't, a lot of them don't directly impact me. And so I just always want to make sure that I'm mindful of my privilege, that I'm not trying to be too Pollyanna about this stuff, that I'm not trying to be like good vibes only, So I really want to make sure that it's important to talk about all of that stuff too. I'll tell you that about a year, I guess 14 months ago now, I thought, I have these good stories to share, and they're little bite-sized stories. They're perfect for TikTok. Let me make these little videos on TikTok.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good idea. Well, that was not a very good idea. I basically got canceled on TikTok um, pretty quickly. I had a 48-hour TikTok experiment because I think that there's the impression that I was trying to be good vibes only.
Mhm.
And so I think it's just, and so that was a lesson learned for
Mhm.
me, right? And
Yeah.
so that's why I'm really trying to find that balance.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. And I think that's such a huge aspect of leadership that we do not talk about because it's not always comfortable. And that's not, as a society, typically what we're used to hearing with leadership. But it happens to all of us in different ways. And if we don't talk about it, for others who are struggling, they don't recognize, oh, this is just kind of part of it. It might look different for everyone else, but it's part of the journey. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. I will be honest. I have come to really enjoy talking about my mistakes.
Mhm.
Um, I do it in my keynotes. I do it in my
Mhm.
workshops. I do it on podcasts because I think it's really important
Mhm.
to create psychological safety. If the people on my team don't know about the mistakes that I make, then they might
Mhm.
feel like they have to get it perfect the first time, right? and
Yeah. Yeah.
and then overthink things. And so I think that it's really important to talk about the mistakes we make. People on their DEI journey, wherever they are, they're going to make
Mhm.
mistakes. And um, if they feel too self-conscious
Mhm.
about and they have these fears about making mistakes, then they're probably not going to do anything. They're probably not going to
Yep.
say anything, and they're going to stay in the status quo. So
Yep.
I love talking about my mistakes.
Yeah, that is awesome. I love that and I applaud you and I hope you keep doing that. And
Thank
I
you.
mean, I don't want you, I mean, the way that came out sounds like keep failing, Bernadette, and share that. But I mean, I just think, again, if we normalize this, if we take away some of that stigma, because like you said, we don't want team members to think that they can't make a mistake, or we don't want them to tell them to feel like they have to cover it up,
Yeah,
right? Like we don't
exactly.
want to orchestrate this culture that isn't possible. Right. So that's a
I love
really
a good
nice
messy
segue. Oh,
first
I'm sorry. Go
draft.
ahead. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was just gonna, I love a
Exactly.
good messy first draft,
Yeah.
and I think
Exactly.
that's where we got to start. And they come a
Hmm.
lot faster.
Yes, 100%. So with that in mind, kind of um, following up with this idea of maybe failure or taking a step back, the first draft, and then figuring out how we do this better or how we do this differently. How do you suggest navigating challenges or resistance when navigating or advocating rather for DEI initiatives in organizations?
I have a new workshop about this, and because it's a hot topic, right?
Mhm.
And I think what's really important to for folks to move from just having good intentions to actually being DEI influencers and change
Mhm.
makers. Um, I think that they really need to have kind of their talking points, and I
Mhm.
think that that includes and must really include a combination of storytelling and
Mhm.
data
Yeah.
because some people are moved by stories and other people are moved by data, right? And so I think when we kind of have what are our core four messages, talking points that are going
Mhm.
to help us make the case? The story should ideally be personal,
Mhm.
something that's meaningful, something that is universal if there's something
Mhm.
so give some story prompts and so folks can
Mhm.
figure out what is that story, and then lots of pieces of data to choose from. And I think that those two things are important. And also, listen, we're not going to get everyone on board, and that's okay. And if we're encountering resistors, the first thing we should do is say, hey, we're not trying to change your beliefs,
Mhm.
we're just trying to align what we're doing with our core values.
Mhm. Yep.
Always bring it back to the company's or the
Mhm.
organization's core values. And
Mhm.
chances are there's something in there, and the guiding principles or the values or the mission or something that
Mhm.
can be related back to diversity, equity, and inclusion somehow, right?
Yep.
Because core values ultimately have something to do with people, right? And the
Mhm.
culture they're trying to create. Whether or not they're lived, that's kind of a different
Mhm.
story.
Yep. Yep.
But ideally, they're talked about.
Thinking about credibility when you're talking about bringing in the storytelling and the data and recognizing that in that way, we're connecting across the board. So if someone wanted to just dismiss this as too warm and fuzzy, they couldn't because there is data to
Mm-hmm.
support that. And the other way, if someone's really connecting with data, but they don't really understand that lived experience for others or what that might mean or what that might look for, we're able to bring those together to create a full picture for someone.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And we're not going to get everyone. We're
Yep.
not. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that as well. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not easy. This work is, no one ever said this is
Mhm.
easy.
Exactly, exactly. And to follow up on that other question, the previous one, so I'm a leadership communication scholar. Communication makes me really excited. And when I was preparing to chat with you, I was thinking about these key communication strategies. So, we've kind of already talked about bringing that storytelling and data, but are there other communication strategies that our titled leaders can use to foster inclusion and to just have a better workplace culture that is inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think a key term here, a key strategy is humility. And I
Mhm.
kind of hinted at that a bit when I was talking about sharing mistakes, talking about kind of creating a learning culture.
Mhm.
But, that really comes down to humility.
Mhm.
And I think great leaders also should be willing to, and this again, humility, admit what you don't know,
Mhm.
because we're not going to have all the answers. And that
Mhm.
again can go towards creating a psychologically safe team. And so humility is key.
Mhm. Yep. I really love that. I think in all of the episodes that I've done, there are a lot of things I hear pretty often, and that's great because they're best practices, but I do not hear enough about humility. So thank you for raising that one up and giving us to think about, remembering that really is part of being a strong communicator and really embodying leadership.
Yeah, because ultimately, we're going to make mistakes.
Mhm.
if,
Yep.
if we can't see all the perspectives, because we can't
Mhm.
possibly see all the perspectives,
Yep.
if we
Mhm.
don't have certain lived experiences,
Mhm.
that when we have humility, it means that we're actually are willing to diversify our teams,
Mhm.
because we know that those diverse identities will help us fill in the gaps in our points of view,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
And
Exactly.
that's how we get to better outcomes. But we
Mhm.
can't think that far ahead unless we first have humility.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that as a stepping stone and a continued, a commitment to humility as we continue to
Hmm.
grow. So, Bernadette, you've already touched on storytelling when you're talking about navigating resistance. But I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit more about what you've seen or what you believe in terms of the role storytelling plays in promoting understanding or empathy among those trying to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, I think that one of the books that I really like is called Inclusion Nudges. And the premise of that book is that we need to use neuroscience
Mhm.
to essentially manipulate change.
Mhm.
So, in order for it to be the most effective. And so
Mhm.
it kind of talks about different ways, sort of the different four different categories, I think, in which people are willing to change.
Mhm.
And one of those categories is feeling the need. They're
Mm.
not going to change unless they feel the need to
Yep.
change, unless they see potentially how it personally affects them. Right. And so feeling the need, it could be one of the ways we can trigger that is with storytelling. Feeling the need could be empathy. And so we can create change that way through telling stories or create behavior change specifically through telling stories. Because when we tell stories, whether they're our own stories, whether they're the stories of clients in the form of case studies, whether they're stories about someone in our family, stories about going back to humility, what it was
Mhm.
like when we first started at the company,
Yep.
a time in which our life was out of balance and we didn't quite have it all together, a mistake that we made, or maybe a time in which we felt like an outsider. These are story prompts that I think that leaders can use
Mhm.
to talk about, and influence buy-in, really, to then
Mhm.
influence change.
Yes. Yes, and I love it's these things that aren't huge, right? You don't need to spend years of work to think about how to thoughtfully integrate these prompts, these story prompts, right? I mean, you need to use them. Uh, you need to go in ready to have the conversation, and like you said, with some humility. But what I love about this work and that response in particular is because I think so many people think this is so daunting. They can never begin this journey. They can never start these conversations. We recognize that there's an on ramp that is pretty
Mhm.
accessible.
And I think that there's a little script.
Hmm.
If I were to make a little script, it would go something like, I don't know everything. So I'm here to tell you that I'm continuing to learn and I want to learn from you.
Hmm.
And I've made mistakes in my past and I haven't always had it together, but I have
Hmm.
a really clear vision and I need your help. Like, I just riffed that,
Yep.
but
Yeah.
essentially, it can go like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you like when I was listening, I hear connection, I hear trust, I hear safe space, I hear empowerment, right? Just in those couple sentences, that is what you've already teed up for me as a team member.
Mhm. Cool.
Yeah. Excellent. And so
Doesn't
my
have to be
next
rocket
question,
science.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think for a lot of people, it feels like that on the outside before they take those first steps. Um, and my next question, this is one that might be another nice on ramp kind of element if you haven't been talking about DEI or doing what you think you should or could be doing, is thinking about safe spaces. And I was thinking about, what would you coach if you have a titled leader coming up to you and saying, the organization isn't where I think it should be. We hear things that I don't think are quite appropriate or I'm not comfortable with, or they're not always inclusive with their language. So, what strategies do you recommend that leaders can utilize to keep the safe space for employees or, helping employees to speak up if they witness or hear exclusive language being used?
Well, I think it's really important for leaders to be let's just get to the policy. So let's
Hmm.
talk first about policy and make sure
Yeah.
that the
Hmm.
anti discrimination policy includes microaggressions in the definition of
Hmm.
harassment, right? So
Yes.
having and hate speech, right? So we want to make
Hmm.
sure that the the bar is actually not all that
Hmm.
low for what
Hmm.
is acceptable. And so that's the first thing. But then when it comes to, actually leadership, um,
Hmm.
and interpersonal dialogue about this, I think it's important to be very clear on what's acceptable and
Hmm.
that psychological safety is incredibly important, and that there will be no retribution
Mhm.
if someone files a complaint.
Mhm. Yep.
So I think that that's really important as well, because I think a lot of people are afraid of retribution and
Mhm.
retaliation.
Yeah, you're right. So it's not just the psychological safety, it's also safety within their livelihoods
That's
and
right.
yeah, ability to thrive in the organization.
Exactly.
So I'm wondering now, so this next question kind of makes extends the previous question in a very real way for us. So I'm wondering if you have a scenario where you intervene to address exclusive language in a professional setting, or maybe you have an experience that you learned from someone through all of the work that you're doing. Just somewhere where we've kind of you've seen this happen. What did it look like, and what were the outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, so this is we see this all the time. Using the wrong pronouns. We have someone on our team who uses they them pronouns,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes they're misgendered. And actually, there have been a couple of occasions in which my company's business manager has misgendered them on a sales call with a client. So
Okay.
before we've even sold this
Yeah.
workshop, while we're talking about it and talking about the facilitator, there have been a
Mm-hmm.
couple of times in which my business manager has used the wrong pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I just say something as simple as um, Irma actually uses they them pronouns, and sometimes I
Mm-hmm.
don't even say that. Sometimes, I just go back to they, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of am
Yep.
very clear, like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they actually are
Mm-hmm.
really great at telling their own story or whatever I happen to want to
Mm-hmm.
add.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they get it, right? And so it all, it's
Mm-hmm.
fine. But I think that the key thing here is that it doesn't have to be a huge deal,
Mm-hmm.
right? We don't need
Yep.
to turn it into this big dramatic
Mm-hmm.
over correction, over apology. Everyone is awkward. Like, no, it
Yep.
doesn't have to be that way. It
Yep.
can be really simple, right? It can be quick. And
Mm-hmm.
folks, unless they're real DEI resistors, they get
Mm-hmm.
it and they appreciate that
Yep.
it's not a big deal, right? And then I think that that gives them a little bit more psychological safety.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for taking the shame out of it, because that's what I think many people are fearful of, or many people have seen others do. And I like how you talk about, so you can model it just by saying they will do this, or this is what they're really, successful at. Or you can be explicit if there's space for that as well, but doing it without the intention of shaming, and rather just, would you say correcting or teaching or modeling?
Yeah,
How would you say? Yeah.
I would say like gently correcting.
Mhm.
I think that, the approach I try to take in or I talk about in my work is really gentle curiosity,
Mm,
and
mhm,
kind of approaching with that. And so I think this is kind of a form of gentle correcting.
mhm. Yeah, I like that gentle curiosity. Excellent. So I'm going to ask you for another example. I'm thinking about kind of, I know that you and your organization, you do solutions oriented work, and I love that. So I'm wondering if you can share a specific story with us when you've taken your solutions oriented approach, and it really had a positive outcome and impact in promoting DEI.
Yeah, I think one of a simple example is we're working with is actually a workshop. We
Mhm,
do a lot of workshops,
mhm,
um and then we collect feedback afterwards. And I just, the types of feedback we hear from our clients about how people have started to change and add pronouns in their email signatures in the middle of the workshop, and it's already
mhm,
working, and the
mhm,
traction is already coming. Like that type of stuff
mhm.
happens, right?
Yep.
And so seeing it like in real time and having our
Mhm.
clients see it in real time
Yeah.
is very cool.
Mhm.
And so that's sort of a simple example. But I gave a keynote last week, and I had at a corporation, and I had time afterwards in a couple of different meetings to really sit and talk to the
Mhm.
employees, and there were leaders in the room as well, so kind of like in listening sessions. Um, and it was really amazing to me to see people already understanding the concept of psychological safety and talking
Mhm.
about it and giving examples of times they felt unpsychologically safe.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
immediately in the immediate aftermath of my session, people had the language and the tools to talk about how they
Mhm.
feel, and they
Yep.
got to do it in front of leaders. And that was a really cool thing to see.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right, that immediate positive change. I think a lot of times until, like you said, we don't have the language. And so I think it's language. I think it's permission too. So by having the organization bring you in, do a keynote, giving that language, I think whether it's explicit or implicit permission, then feeling like, okay, now I have the lens to understand this. I have the vocabulary to articulate it, and to have people excited about that as an organizational scholar, that really warms my heart.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was a beautiful thing for me to see
Mhm.
because, to be honest, this was a corporation in a conservative industry in a conservative part of the US, and the leaders were there in that room, and they were like, "I hear you, and we are gonna do
Yeah,
better." And it was just, I mean,
amazing.
it was just like I actually wrote about it in my 5 Things newsletter
Mhm.
this past weekend because he said, when people are asking me if we're retreating on DEI, I said, no, we are only moving forward. We are doubling
Yep,
down. And that was
yep,
his quote. I'm like, you know what? This is a straight white dude in
yep.
the US South. And,
Mhm.
we're gonna be okay.
Yes, yeah, I have goosebumps when you were saying that. So you're like, "Oh, there's gonna be change." There, you're right, it's very optimistic, very hopeful.
That's my brand.
Excellent. So, Bernadette, I have 2 final questions for you, and these go hand in hand, and I like to end every episode of The Communicative Leader with advice or challenges or tips for first our titled leaders and then our employees across all ranks, across industries. And it can be leadership communication, just something that you want to leave them with. So we'll start with our titled leaders. So what do you have for those folks out there?
Think about some story prompts. I
Mhm.
mentioned a few in this episode, but think about little story prompts that you can use to talk to people on your team. So, a mistake that you've made in the past, a time that you felt like your life was out of balance, a time that you felt like an outsider. Come up with a quick story
Mhm.
that shows that you have humility, and
Yep.
don't be afraid to talk about that story. Um, Especially when people seem to be really struggling. Maybe you have
Mhm.
more than one story. You probably do.
Yep. Yeah, excellent. It's simple but powerful, right? And I love those. And then for our friends out there, so this next bit of advice or challenge or tip, all employees, all ranks across all industries, what do you want to leave them with?
I want you to think about the people on your team with some gentle curiosity. You might think that some of these folks are really annoying, but what if you were just a little bit more curious and perhaps a little bit less judgmental?
Mhm.
What would that look like? And Um, yeah. So think about that, and maybe take a little bit of time to get to know people a little bit better with that
Mhm.
sense of gentle curiosity.
Yes, right? Because that is a workplace I want to be a part of.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, Bernadette, thank you for joining us today on The Communicative Leader. I have learned a lot. I've had a lot of fun chatting with you and learning from you, and I know our listeners will as well.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's been really great. You're a great interviewer. You had fantastic questions, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on The Communicative Leader.